You live long enough, and the noise of life starts to fade. That night was one of those nights. Nothing special about it. Just me, an old man sitting in his quiet house, with a Bible open on my lap and a heart still restless after all these years. I wasn't looking for religion. I was looking for peace, the kind that money can't buy and fame can't fake. Maybe that's what time does to you. When you've seen enough battles, both on screen and in real life, you start to crave stillness more than victory. The words on the page blurred together. Psalms, John, words about mercy and rest, and before I knew it, the world around me began to drift away. Funny thing about getting older, you start to realize that even your sleep becomes a kind of prayer. You lie there hoping to wake up with a lighter soul than the one that went to bed. I thought about the faces I'd met, the places I'd been, war zones, movie sets, lonely roads, and I wondered what it was all for. You spend decades chasing the next hill, the next success, the next purpose, and then one night you sit in the quiet and realize the only thing you've ever been chasing is peace. Not applause, not legacy, just peace. I remember the way the house sounded that night, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind outside. Even that had a rhythm, like the world was breathing with me. I whispered a prayer I hadn't said since I was a boy. Lord, if you're still listening, teach me how to rest. Not rest like sleep, but the kind of rest that lets a man forgive himself for the things he can't change. Somewhere between that thought and the next heartbeat, I must have crossed into another kind of silence. Not the silence of age, but of eternity, the kind that makes you feel small but safe at the same time. And as my eyes grew heavy, I felt something inside me begin to loosen, like a soldier finally laying down his weapon after a long war. I didn't know it then, but that was the night everything changed. That was the night the search for peace led me somewhere I never expected, to a light that didn't hurt, to a truth that didn't accuse, and to a voice that would remind me what real peace actually means. It's hard to explain what happened next, but I'll try. Somewhere between sleep and consciousness, I found myself standing in a light that didn't hurt. It wasn't like the harsh glare of a spotlight or the cold flash of a camera. It was alive. It had weight, warmth, and peace all at once. Every inch of me felt known, as if the light could see through everything I'd ever been, and still wasn't turning away. That's when I saw him. And believe me, you don't mistake that kind of presence. I didn't need an introduction. Every cell in my body just knew it was Jesus. Not the Sunday school version with soft hands and polished robes. He looked timeless, like the strength of the mountains and the calm of the ocean had taken human form. There was power in him, but it wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that didn't have to prove anything. When he looked at me, it wasn't judgment I felt, it was recognition. The kind that makes you remember who you were meant to be before the world taught you to build walls. His eyes held eternity in them, yet they were filled with the gentleness of someone who's seen every failure, every scar, and still calls you worthy. I couldn't speak. What do you say when you're standing in front of the Son of God? The air around us felt still, like time itself was waiting to listen. Then he spoke. The sound of his voice wasn't loud, but it carried through me like thunder beneath calm water. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to move you, it just was. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about faith, about heaven, about myself shifted. I realized this wasn't about fear or religion, it was about presence. About the reality of something so vast, so personal, that it makes every title, every success, every failure seem small. You know, I've met a lot of powerful people in my life. Presidents, generals, studio heads, but none of them could fill a room the way he filled that light. There was no ego, no demand, just truth standing there in quiet strength. And as I stood in that presence, I understood for the first time what real power looks like. It doesn't crush, it restores. It doesn't intimidate, it invites. And as I took it all in, I knew deep down this moment wasn't a dream. It was a meeting, a reminder that no matter how far you think you've wandered, heaven still knows your name. He looked at me with that steady calm that could quiet a storm, and said, "Clint, you've seen much of this world, but only from one side of the window." His words hit like a slow bullet. I didn't understand at first. Then he continued, "You've walked through a land divided by skin, stories, and fear. But I didn't create color to divide you. I created it to teach you love in shades." That line burned itself into me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I thought of all the years I'd watched the world tear itself apart over differences that were never meant to be walls. You grow up thinking you know how the world works, who belongs where, what side of the street you walk on, but the truth is, most of us live trapped behind invisible glass, watching life instead of really living it. I'd seen segregation, riots, movements, watched history try to heal itself while people kept reopening the same wounds. And now here he was, telling me it was never supposed to be that way. I realized then that heaven doesn't see in black and white, it sees in light, every shade, every culture, every story, pieces of one great painting. And we're the ones who've been arguing over the colors while forgetting the art. I remember once, years ago, filming a Western out in Texas. Between takes, one of the crew, a black man, sat with me under the desert sun. We didn't talk much, just shared a drink, shared the silence. I saw the same fatigue in his eyes that I've seen in soldiers, the kind that comes from fighting battles you didn't choose. And now, standing before Jesus, I finally understood what that look meant. It wasn't bitterness. It was endurance. It was grace. "Color," he said, "was my way of showing you love's depth, but you turned it into distance." The words echoed through me like a confession I didn't know I was making. We built fences out of what God painted as beauty. We forgot that difference wasn't a mistake, it was a message. You see, when you spend enough time on this earth, you realize the lines we draw aren't real. They're shadows cast by fear. And fear has no place where love is supposed to live. That night, standing in that light, I saw the world the way it was meant to be, one masterpiece, every hue a heartbeat of heaven. And I thought maybe that's what faith really is, not believing in what divides us, but finally seeing what connects us. He looked straight into me, not at me, but into me, and said, "When I walked this earth, I chose the broken places to reveal heaven. The poor, the rejected, the ones the world didn't want to touch. And if I walked among you today, you'd find me in the faces of the ones still fighting to be seen." His words hung there like smoke in sunlight, settling deep where truth usually hides. I felt my heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. He wasn't talking about history. He was talking about now. About the people we pass every day without seeing. Then he said, "Black people carry a rhythm of heaven in their suffering and their strength. They've been bruised by history, but their spirit never broke. That's not human will alone. That's divine fire." I'd spent my life filming stories about courage heroes who faced bullets, deserts, and storms, but the kind of courage he was describing wasn't the kind you could choreograph for the screen. It was the quiet kind, the kind that keeps singing through pain, forgiving through injustice, building through ashes. I saw flashes of the world I'd known. Gospel choirs lifting hands to heaven after generations of hardship, mothers raising children with laughter that could drown out sorrow, men working under the weight of centuries yet still standing tall, and I thought maybe that's what holiness looks like when it's worn by flesh. He said, "They have carried the world's sins on their backs and still found joy in the morning. Do you not see my fingerprints in that?" I couldn't look away. I remembered faces, musicians, laborers, soldiers, people who had every reason to turn bitter but chose hope instead. I saw it in the music, the blues, the soul, the gospel. It wasn't just sound. It was endurance made beautiful. Every note was a testimony. We are still here. And it hit me, maybe God hides his greatest strength in the people the world underestimates most. You see, pain is a strange kind of forge. It can break a man or make him shine. And some souls, the ones who've walked through fire and come out still singing, carry a light the rest of us can barely understand. Standing in that presence, I realized what he was showing me wasn't just about race, it was about revelation. That divine strength isn't born in comfort, it's born in the fire of those who refuse to stop loving in a world that keeps giving them reasons not to. And in that moment, I saw it clear as day. The rhythm of heaven is written in their endurance. He stepped closer, not in distance, but in presence, and his words came like a slow sunrise over my soul. The color of a man's skin, he said, is not a mark of difference, it's a brushstroke of purpose. And when you despise the painting, you insult the artist. That line hit me harder than any truth I'd ever heard. I'd spent my life surrounded by art films, music, stories, all made by human hands. I knew what it felt like to pour your heart into a creation, to have every detail mean something. And now I understood that's what God did with us. Every tone, every culture, every face was part of his masterpiece. Yet we spend our lives arguing over which color belongs in the frame. I sat there in that divine light, realizing how blind I'd been. I'd admired sunsets, desert canyons, the golden dust of dawn, never once questioning why they came in so many shades. But when it came to people, I'd drawn lines where God had painted beauty. He wasn't condemning me, he was awakening me. I could see it now. The way a black man's laughter could fill a room, the way a child's brown hands could lift another's without question, the way every shade of skin reflected light differently, yet all of it came from the same sun. "Why did you forget what I made?" he asked softly. That question didn't accuse, it invited me to look at humanity as a living gallery of God's imagination. I thought of the people I'd known across decades, the broken, the bold, the quiet souls who carried the world's weight, and I realized how often I'd admired their courage without recognizing it was divine artistry at work. You see, when you stand close enough to a painting, all you see are brushstrokes. But when you step back, you see the masterpiece. That's what he was showing me. The world's been standing too close, seeing fragments instead of the whole. Maybe that's why we keep missing the picture. I remember whispering, "Lord, what do you want me to do with this?" And he said, "Speak." Not to impress, not to divide, but to remind them of what I showed you. That morning, when I woke up, the world didn't look the same. Every face I saw carried something sacred, every color told a story, and every encounter felt like standing before living art. I realized then that we don't just live in God's creation, we are his creation. And every time we look down on another, we're tearing a page out of his masterpiece. When I woke, my pillow was damp, though I didn't remember crying. Maybe my soul had wept for me. The morning light slipped through the curtains like a quiet visitor, softer than usual, almost sacred. The world felt different, gentler, slower, like it was breathing in rhythm with something unseen. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just listening. The house was still. The hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind, all of it seemed to have meaning. I wasn't the same man who'd closed his eyes the night before. Something had cracked open inside me. Something I hadn't felt in decades. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and whispered a simple prayer. "Lord, make me see." It wasn't a prayer for miracles or fame or forgiveness, just sight. The kind that sees beyond the surface, beyond the noise. And for the first time, I did. The sunlight on the table, the birds calling outside, even the dust floating in the air, it all felt alive, like the world had been repainted overnight with grace instead of gravity. You know, there's a moment in a man's life when the noise of everything he's built finally fades, and what's left is truth. That morning was that moment for me. I didn't rush to tell anyone. How could I? Some things aren't meant to be explained, they're meant to be lived. I just knew I'd been shown something real, something worth carrying quietly. I thought back on my life, fame, success, the applause, the loneliness that followed when the lights went out, and I realized how much I'd been seeing without really seeing. I looked at people as roles, as parts of a story, not as souls painted by the same hand that made me. But that dream, that encounter, changed the way I looked at everything. Every stranger became a question, what piece of God's art are you? The world hadn't changed, but my eyes had. The weight I'd carried for years felt lighter, like someone had reached into my chest and swapped bitterness for wonder. I think that's what grace does. It doesn't erase your past, it redeems your vision. That morning, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't go back to sleep, not the kind of sleep that keeps a man blind to the beauty around him. And as I sat there watching the day unfold, I realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't happen in dreams. They happen when you finally wake up. After that morning, I started seeing the world differently. Faces I might have once passed without notice now carried something sacred, something eternal. It wasn't like a flash of lightning or some mystical glow. It was quieter than that, deeper. I'd be walking down the street, and I'd see a young black man heading to work before dawn, earbuds in, shoulders squared against the day, and I'd think, that's strength. Not the kind that flexes or shouts, but the kind that shows up, day after day, without applause. Or I'd see an older woman at the bus stop, her hands lined with years of work, her eyes still full of peace. And I'd think, that's grace. The world moves fast, but she's learned the art of stillness. One afternoon, I stopped at a diner I'd been going to for years. The waitress, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, came over with a smile that could have lit the place brighter than the neon sign outside. She was African American, polite, kind, and she asked if I wanted my coffee black. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, and I smiled to myself. Yes, I said quietly, black. But as she poured, I remembered that dream, Jesus standing there saying, when you despise the painting, you insult the artist. And suddenly it wasn't just a cup of coffee. It was a reminder. This world has spent too long arguing about colors instead of admiring the art. When she walked away, I whispered under my breath, thank you, Lord. I see it now. Every person I met after that seemed like a living parable, people carrying a quiet power the world overlooks. The janitor who hums gospel songs as he sweeps. The mechanic with oil-stained hands who still says grace before lunch. The teacher who stays late to make sure a kid has food to take home. Ordinary people, extraordinary souls. I used to think heroes wore badges or capes, but now I know better. Real heroism is hidden in the everyday, the resilience to keep loving, to keep hoping, to keep forgiving when the world gives you no reason to. That's divine strength. That's the rhythm of heaven playing through human hands. You see, I'd spent decades looking for God in cathedrals and sunsets, but it turns out he'd been walking past me the whole time, smiling through strangers, breathing through struggle, showing me that holiness wears every face. And once you start seeing that, you can't stop. Because the truth is, there's no such thing as an ordinary person, only extraordinary reflections of an artist who never runs out of colors. It took me a while to realize that what I saw that night wasn't just about race, it was about vision. Jesus hadn't come to lecture me on history or politics. He came to heal the part of me that had forgotten how to see. The dream wasn't meant to divide people into categories. It was meant to open my eyes to something far deeper. It wasn't about color, it was about clarity. You see, we walk through life half blind most of the time. We think we see people, but really we're just seeing reflections of our own fears, opinions, and assumptions. We look through fogged glass and call it truth. I used to think wisdom came from experience, but now I believe real wisdom comes from learning how to see with compassion instead of comparison. After that dream, I noticed something shift inside me. The world looked the same, but it felt different. I began to see people as living mirrors of the Creator, each one carrying a fingerprint of divinity, even the ones I disagreed with, even the ones the world had given up on. I'd see a man arguing on the corner, his voice full of anger, and instead of judging him, I'd wonder what pain made him raise his voice that high. I'd see a woman working 2 jobs to feed her family and realize I was standing in the presence of a quiet kind of holiness, the kind that doesn't need a pulpit to preach. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking, what's wrong with people? And started asking, what happened to them? That simple question changed everything. It made me slower to speak, quicker to listen, and a little more careful with my words. You can't look at someone as a problem once you start seeing them as a story God's still writing. And that's when it hit me this dream wasn't about guilt, it was about awakening. It wasn't about division, it was about sight. Jesus had used the story of race as a mirror to show me a deeper blindness, the blindness that keeps us from recognizing God in one another, the blindness that builds walls instead of bridges. It's easy to point at darkness in the world, but harder to admit the shadows in our own hearts. And yet, that's where light begins inside the eyes of a man who finally learns to see. So now, when I meet someone different from me, I remind myself, I'm not here to understand everything about them. I'm here to recognize the fingerprint of the one who made them. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That's the real vision, and that's what the dream was always trying to teach me. A few days after that dream, I drove across town to a little church I'd passed 100 times but never stepped inside. It wasn't a grand cathedral or some Hollywood chapel. It was small, tucked between two brick buildings, with a hand-painted sign out front that read New Hope Missionary Baptist Church. I didn't tell anyone who I was. I just walked in, found a seat in the back, and waited. The room was alive before the service even started, children laughing, women hugging, men shaking hands like brothers who'd been through a war together. When the music began, it wasn't polite or rehearsed, it was raw, thunderous, and beautiful. The choir sang like their souls were on fire, every note lifting the roof a little higher. It wasn't performance, it was conversation. You could feel it. They weren't singing about God, they were singing to Him. I closed my eyes, and it was like standing in the middle of a storm and sunlight at the same time. Every clap, every shout, every tear, it wasn't noise, it was truth breaking loose. I'd sat through plenty of church services in my life, all tidy and well-timed, but this was different. This was faith with a pulse. And somewhere between the hymns and the hallelujahs, something in me cracked open. I didn't feel guilt or shame, I felt humility. The kind that strips you of pride and leaves you standing bare before grace itself. Watching them worship, I realized faith isn't a Sunday routine, it's breath. It's survival. It's joy that refuses to die, even in the face of hardship. These people weren't performing religion, they were living resurrection. I saw faces glowing with hope, voices trembling with gratitude, hands lifted not in desperation but in celebration. And I thought, this is what Jesus meant. This is what it looks like when the human spirit refuses to surrender. When the service ended, an older man came up to me, his hand rough and warm. "Brother," he said with a smile, "I'm glad you came. God's been waiting for you." I didn't have words, just nodded, feeling something deep settle inside me. On the drive home, that line echoed in my mind, God's been waiting for you. Maybe He'd been waiting for me to stop observing faith like a spectator and start living it like a believer. That morning, in that little church, I didn't find religion. I found renewal. I found a heartbeat I thought I'd lost. And I realized faith isn't something you attend, it's something that attends to you. Network connection lost. Attempting to reconnect. After that Sunday morning, I couldn't go back to life as usual. Something inside me had shifted quietly but permanently. You can't see truth that deep and walk away unchanged. For weeks I wrestled with it. How do you tell people that you saw Jesus in a dream and that He spoke about love, unity, and the sacred worth of every person without sounding like you've lost your mind? I wasn't worried about my reputation. I'd lived long enough not to care about headlines, but I was worried about meaning. Truth, I learned, isn't something you can force down people's throats. It's something you live, breathe, and offer with gentleness. So I started small, conversations, moments. Whenever someone around me made a careless remark about another race or joked in that way that hides poison behind laughter, I didn't fight them with anger. I just asked questions. You ever wonder why you think that way? Or, what if you're wrong about them? Sometimes they laughed it off. Sometimes they went quiet. But I could see it in their eyes, a crack forming in the wall. That's where change begins. Not with outrage, not with shouting, but with reflection. The world has enough noise, it's starving for understanding. You see, I've lived through decades of protests, politics, and slogans, and while some of it wakes people up, most of it just makes them shout louder across the same divide. Real change doesn't happen when you win an argument, it happens when you touch a heart. And you can't do that with fists, you do it with open hands. I started realizing people aren't cruel by nature, they're blind by habit. They grow up believing stories about who's less and who's more, and those lies get repeated until they start sounding like truth. But the truth I was shown in that dream was simple. God doesn't make mistakes, and He doesn't repeat colors by accident. Every shade of skin is a letter in a sentence He's writing about humanity, and when we ignore one, the whole message loses meaning. I think about that every time I speak now, whether it's to a friend, a stranger, or an audience. I don't preach, I just share what I saw, because people don't need another sermon, they need a reminder. A reminder that compassion doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, and kindness doesn't need a spotlight to change the world. Sometimes all it takes is one calm voice in a noisy room saying, "Look again, there's more here than you think." And that's how healing begins. Months passed before I ever spoke about the dream in public. I kept it close, like a sacred ember I wasn't ready to expose to the wind. But there came a day when silence felt heavier than fear. I'd been invited to a small film event, something about legacy, storytelling, the usual questions about fame and life lessons. I stood there under the lights, looking out at a sea of faces, and I remembered His words, "Tell them what I showed you." So I did. I told them about the night I met Jesus in a light that didn't hurt, about what He said to me, not as a sermon, not as a spectacle, but as truth that demanded to be lived. I told them how I'd realized that Black people, through centuries of suffering, had turned pain into prayer and struggle into song, and that maybe the world's been too blind to see the divine fire burning there. When I finished, the room went still. You could have heard a pin drop. Some faces looked moved, others skeptical. That's the thing about truth, it doesn't always make people comfortable. Afterward, a young man came up to me, African American, maybe in his 30s. He said, "Mr. Eastwood, I never thought I'd hear someone like you say something like that." Then he smiled and added, "Thank you for seeing us." Those 5 words hit me harder than any award I've ever received. Because that's all any of us really want, to be seen, truly seen. Of course, not everyone reacted that way. A few letters came later, some kind, others angry. One said, "You're ruining your legacy talking about race and religion." Another said, "About time someone with your voice said what needed saying." I read them all and folded them away. This wasn't about approval, it was about obedience. You see, Jesus didn't give me a campaign, He gave me compassion. And compassion isn't glamorous, it doesn't trend. It costs you something. It makes you care when it'd be easier to look away. But that's the purpose I was given, to speak gently where others shout, to love where others judge, to remind people that the color of our skin was never meant to divide us, it was meant to display God's art. I am not here to change the world, I'm here to change my corner of it, one heart at a time. That's what I tell folks now. Don't wait for someone else to start the fire. Be the light where you stand. Because when love becomes your mission, you don't need a crowd's applause, you just need the courage to keep your heart open, even when the world closes its eyes. Now that I'm in the later stretch of life, the noise of the world doesn't bother me much anymore. The headlines fade, the applause quiets, and what's left are a few truths that finally stand still long enough for you to see them. I've made a lot of movies about courage, justice, right and wrong, but the older I get, the more I realize the greatest story isn't the one you film, it's the one you live. And the plot of that story always comes down to one question. Did you learn to love? That dream I had years ago still echoes in me like a distant melody. It wasn't about race. Not really. It was about sight learning to see what's divine in the people we overlook. I've come to believe that every person walking this earth is a brushstroke in God's grand masterpiece, and no color, no culture, no story is a mistake. The same God who shaped the stars also shaped every shade of skin, every rhythm, every laugh, every tear. You can't despise another person without insulting the artist. You can't claim to know love and still draw lines around who deserves it. These days, when I meet someone, a stranger in a store, a kid on a movie set, a man begging on the corner, I try to look a little longer, listen a little deeper. Because I know now that heaven's fingerprints are everywhere, hidden in ordinary faces. Maybe the point of living isn't to fix the whole world. Maybe it's just to keep your corner of it honest to see, to forgive, to love without keeping score. Sometimes I sit on my porch at sunset, coffee in hand, and think about the people who've crossed my path, the strong, the broken, the quiet souls who carried light through dark places. I think about how Jesus said, "Tell them what I showed you." And I guess that's what I've been trying to do ever since. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that love has no color. It doesn't ask where you're from, what you've done, or what you believe. It just asks if you're willing to see. Maybe that's what heaven really looks like, not clouds and harps, but a place where no one's afraid to be seen, where every face is recognized and cherished. And when my time comes, I don't want to be remembered for the movies or the fame. I just hope someone says, "He saw me." Because that's what love does, it sees. It listens, it redeems. And if I've learned anything in all these years, it's this: God's greatest work of art is humanity itself, and his favorite color is all of them.